Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jacqueline Dorsey of Lean Frontiers and I'll serve as your host today. I'm excited to bring to you today a short webinar on lean coaching facilitated by Ron Oslin. This session is being recorded if you want to refer back to it later. So for now, let me turn things over to Ron.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Good afternoon, everyone. Today's short webinar is going to be related to coaching past denial and resistance, and actually helping folks overcome the addiction to status quo. And we'll talk more about that as we go. So just a quick introduction. I'm a leadership coach and a leadership therapist at Capital One, as well as a senior coach with One System, One Voice. We have a team of coaches at One System, One Voice that we work with different organizations, and Capital One is one of our primaries. So we're going to use them today as our primary source of learning. So let's look at our dance card that we're going to have for today. We're going to talk about 5 things: the wisdom about change that we've learned, the addiction to status quo. We're going to talk about wrestling versus dancing. We're going to talk about a technique called motivational interviewing, and then we're going to discuss where and how to learn more. So as we begin to talk about change, it's important for us to look at and think about some statistics that are out there related to what many of us are doing. So today, 97% of all transformations fail. And when we talk about transformations, we're talking about organizational and big change. 90% of individuals will relapse and return to the condition before any change. So many of you may have seen things like you've implemented something and then you go back a week or two later or a month later and it's sort of returned back to what they are. That's what we mean by relapse. 51% of associates are not engaged, 88% of associates don't have passion for their work, and 80% of senior managers are not passionate about their work. Einstein once said, if we continue to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results, then that's simply the definition of insanity. So we think there's a time for change. What we did is we went out and did research. We looked for wisdom from lots of different places. And when it comes to helping people and assisting people change from one condition to another condition, maybe it's from an organization that is more command and control to an organization that's lean. Maybe it's changing from one computer system to another computer system. We found some really good advice from our friends in the clinical community. So today we're going to talk about that advice and that wisdom, if you will, actually deployed in a bank. So the one thing that we have to realize, and we came to the realization of, is that a large percentage of people in any organization are actually addicted to status quo. Now that's a really powerful phrase, and the word addiction actually conjures up in a lot of people's minds some really negative things. However, let's take a quick look at what addiction really means. So addiction is defined in many dictionaries as a state of compulsive engagement in rewarding stimuli despite the consequences. And it really has little to no connection to a pejorative meaning. So let's talk about some examples real fast. I'm betting some of you on this webinar may know someone who has what might be considered a cell phone addiction. They, in the middle of a meeting, in the middle of a conversation with you, in the middle of a conversation with a friend, when the cell phone buzzes, they stop the conversation and immediately pick up their phone. All of that is a form of addiction. It's a compulsive engagement in the rewarding stimuli of getting some sort of information, and they're ignoring the consequences around them. People will run regardless of the consequences to their body, their knees, the weather. People will read, and they will ignore their family, what's around them. Watching TV is similar. In the business setting, we have some similar ones, such as we have some leaders that will not let others solve problems because they're chasing the big high from the solution that they themselves implement. Or some are addicted to, if it's not invented here, then it can't be any good. And there's lots of others. In fact, a lot of brain research shows that the brain is actually predispositioned to addiction. It looks for patterns. We love patterns, and when it finds a pattern and it gets some sort of reward, it wants to repeat that pattern over and over. So the idea of addiction to status quo means that actually, instead of people just having a desire to maintain it, they're actually addicted to it. They will do whatever they have to do to maintain it. So what does that mean for a real organization? Well, according to some research we've done and that the medical community's done, here is a typical breakdown of what any organization or group of people look like when it comes to a change. There are essentially 5 different categories. Now you see some fancy names such as contemplation, preparation, action, maintenance, pre-contemplation. Those all come out of the medical field, and you can see the reference down at the bottom to De Clemente. What we've done is kind of mapped that to the business world and said, so for those folks that are in a pre-contemplative state, they just don't get it. These are folks that have no intention of changing, that will actively tell you, this is not for me. The contemplative or contemplation state is what we consider people being not on board. They've thought about it, they've weighed some pros and cons, but they're really saying in their own mind, I'm going to wait this one out. If I wait long enough, this too shall pass, is a common phrase. Those people in preparation, or what we call supportive, are the folks that talk a really good game. They say things like, I will support you in this change. I'm behind you. But they're really not doing much themselves in the way of change. And then the action and the maintenance are what we call engaged and adopters. These are the people we love, because these are the people that are reaching out to us on a regular basis and saying, hey, I've done something, I need a little help, can you coach me here, coach me there, help me get better. The important part of this picture is take a look at the sizes of the pie. Only about 25% of the people in any organization are really actively trying to make a change. The other 75% are actually sitting on the sidelines in most cases, and they're waiting for the next thing. What that means, though, to us as coaches is that when we look at what we've all been taught about classical coaching, we should ask questions. We should use the Socratic method. We find that the medical community has realized that only these 3 small segments do those methods apply. So for 25% of the population, classical coaching as we know it is applicable. For the other 75%, actually what we've been taught over the years is in some ways causing more resistance and lowering the rate of change. So if we really want change to occur in our organizations, we've got to sit back and think about our paradigms. We've got to think about what we've been doing and the results that we've been getting. Remember that early slide on where we talked about 90% of the people relapsing and moving backwards to what they were doing before, or 97% of transformations actually failing. Now, I'm not suggesting that the methods that we use are not valuable. In fact, communicating through all-hands meetings, communicating through PowerPoint presentations, through newsletters, through email, are all still good and vital ways to communicate with people. What we're learning, though, is those are great ways to present information those are not great ways to cause change. There's an interesting learning from the folks in the clinical community that routinely assist people with some sort of change they need to make in their life. The change could be related to weight or smoking, or it could be related to something that's going on in their family, or it could be related to something they're doing in their professional life. But there are many people out there who are very good at helping people. Here's what they've learned, though, and here's what we must, as a group, learn, and that is, before we can assist someone in changing, we have to come to the realization that no person can change another person, that change comes from within. So human beings are not like washing machines. They're not like cars. As a leader, I can't look at another person and say, wow, there's something that they need to change, and here is that little component in their brain, and I need to take it out, and I need to put the new one in. It doesn't work that way. What we have to do is help the person and assist the person come to the realization that they need to change. In fact, when we move away from the idea of persuasion and influence and essentially coercion and move to a state of assistance and invoking change from within, we see some really high numbers in real change. Which brings us to our next thing we have to talk about a little bit, and that is, what is real change? We've learned there are two types of change. There's what we consider behavioral change, and there's what we consider compliance. And most people, when they step back and they honestly think about these two things, they can recognize them pretty quickly. So let's talk about behavioral change. So in order for a real behavioral change to occur, we've got to get down and understand why people assume it's okay to do what they're doing. We need to understand their beliefs. And when we have real change, we may not be able to change the belief, but we can help a person alter their assumptions. Each day, all of us have assumptions that we've never tested or vetted with anyone. So as part of the working with people to help change occur, we have to understand assumptions and work through those. So when real behavioral change occurs, we get assumptions realigned, our beliefs are aligned, our words, our body actions, and our language are all aligned. We've actually got to determine what the reward was that was causing the behavior. Our learning is this: external rewards have very little to do with behavioral change. It's all about intrinsic rewards. So let's think about that for a second. Let's talk about the leader just for a second, who is a great problem solver but won't let others solve problems. Why is that? We can have an intellectual conversation with them, and we can offer all kinds of logic as to why it would be better if the members of their team or their organization participated in problem solving. The reality of it is there's an intrinsic reward that they are getting that we haven't addressed, and that intrinsic reward is the high, the reward that they get internally from solving the problem, them being in the limelight, them doing the work. And until we replace that, they will continue that old behavior. So we've got to figure out what the intrinsic reward is and help an individual with a replacement. And then most important, when there's a real behavioral change, the new behavior is maintained under stress, and the new behavior is maintained when external stimuli have been removed. Now let's contrast that with compliance. Now, compliant behavior is really dependent upon the setting. So many of us have sat in meetings and we have communicated to our lead in some way that something needs to change. and we have all observed heads going up and down and people appearing to be on board, only to find out later that they're not quite on board. Or the other thing that we see, if we're really observant, is the words, the actions, and the body language are inconsistent with people in compliance. They're talking one thing, they're doing another, and most important, people that are compliant are only doing so as long as there's external stimuli. They're being monitored, there are reports, somebody is observing them, and during those times they will maintain compliance, and when that is taken away, they go back to their natural behavior. Now, as a leader, the big question that we have to ask ourselves is, are your expectations aligned with your journey and or your methods? So are you, in whatever change you're trying to do, are you using methods that are creating compliant behavior and you're expecting the behavior associated with a behavioral change and you're expecting the outcomes? For instance, if you're expecting people to volunteer, to identify problems, to raise their hand, to help solve problems, yet your method is creating compliant behavior, then your expectations of all of that engagement are not going to be realized. And again, this is where we go back and look at some of the employee statistics around a high percentage of our associates are not fully engaged. Well, fully engaged associates are the ones who are volunteering. They're the ones who are identifying problems. So if we want that as an outcome, we've got to learn how to create behavioral change, not create compliance, which is what we're going to talk about. So typically, if you coach people who do not want to be coached, some interesting things happened. And some of you may have tried this. Some of you may have had a friend who said something they needed to change, and you've tried to use logic, you've tried to use your influence, you've tried to use your intellect to persuade them, to make suggestions, to offer advice, to tell them your story. What happens in this case, though, is resistance is going up and change is going down. So when the listener argues for change, by the way, in this case, the listener is actually the leader, the speaker, which is the led, starts to argue to stay the same. They start to build reasons why they should not change. We refer to this as wrestling. In many ways, the leader is trying to impose their will and sort of sit back and say, if I do this enough, I will wrestle you to the ground, and my will overcome yours. This is very tiring. It takes a lot of energy, and more importantly, it takes a lot of ongoing maintenance, reports, extra supervision, all sorts of things. What we need to learn to do is dance. So in the clinical community, they've learned dancing. What do we mean by dancing? Well, dancing, we as a listener want to use empathy. And we want to use something called accurate empathy, which is really understanding the other person and their reasons for status quo. And let the speaker, the person who needs to change, explore options for change. And let them create their own argument for change. Now, just like in dancing, there is a leader, and someone is leading the conversation. We have to lead in a way, though, that allows the other person to participate and want to dance with us. In wrestling, our job is to wrestle them to the ground and to force our will over theirs. In dancing, we want to work with them. We want to explore with them. We want them to get to a condition to where they are our advocate and they are our best resource when we're not in the room for the change. So in the clinical community, years ago, two gentlemen, Dr. Miller and Dr. Rolnick, observed the response rate, if you will, and the cure rate to people with deep-rooted habits or addictions. And they discovered that the rates of change were very poor. So they began exploring other methods. So they introduced a book. It's now in its third edition, called Motivational Interviewing. We use this book as our reference guide. It is meant for the clinical community. If you so choose to read this material, please be advised that it is mostly clinical settings. It talks about people who need to make life changes. However, if you simply replace some of the conversations with something that is happening in the business world, it is a very, very helpful read. MI, or motivational interviewing, is, when you boil it down, it is a person-centered conversation style for addressing ambivalence. And it switches the conversation from being a persuasion type conversation to being a real listening conversation. Now, many of us were taught active listening years ago. This is well beyond active listening. Active listening is one of the techniques that's part of MI, but there's a whole lot more than just active listening. MI is built upon three components. And when we learn MI, we have to learn the spirit, we have to learn the listening skills, and we have to learn the techniques. MI is a process. It has, like anything else, it has inputs, there's a process part, and there's outputs. So we're not going to go through all of these today because MI is an extensive course in learning, and we can help you with that. But let's talk a little bit about why we use MI. So research says that when we do MI and we use empathy, we have high levels of speakers who are less resistant, they're more likely to stay engaged, they're more likely to change their behavior, and they're less likely to relapse. Now, if you're a leader and you're trying to do a change, all of those things are really exciting. I've got people that are less resistant, I got more people that want to talk to me, I got more people that want to change, and they stay changed. It doesn't get any better. So we've learned that empathy is the single best predictor of helping people with deep-rooted habits. There's a phrase that I'll actually ask you guys to kind of memorize, and in your conversations coming up here soon that you're trying to help someone with. Are you trying to be interested in them, their point of view, what their reasons are for maintaining status quo or for not changing? Or are you trying to be interesting and tell your story and trying to convince them of something that they may or may not be interested in? We find this, if people put this phrase in their mind when they're having their conversations, the intent of the conversation changes dramatically. Now, let's just summarize a little bit about this thing called motivational interviewing and the spirit. We have learned that direct persuasion is not effective for resolving ambivalence. So if people are on the fence, they've weighed the pros and cons, and they're simply sitting back and saying, you know, I think I'm going to wait this one out, persuasion does not get them there. Influence, all the things that we've been taught as traditional coaching actually creates more resistance. MI is quiet and eliciting. It's done one-on-one, one-on-two or three. It's small groups. It's highly effective. Many people think it's going to take a long time. It actually goes really fast because if we get everybody supporting us, change will occur very quickly. And the important thing here is it's the listener's job to resolve their ambivalence, the speaker's job to resolve their ambivalence, not the listener's job. The listener's job is to be directive in helping the listener, the speaker, but it's really the speaker's job to resolve ambivalence. So let's talk real quickly about some lessons we've learned. What's important is we have to understand people's assumptions, meet them where they are. The intellectual argument will always fail. We've got to align values and actions. Leaders must lead, not support. And it's about demonstrated proficiency, not training. We can train all day long, but people have to demonstrate proficiency. Now, here's an interesting fact that we've learned. Using MI, if you've practiced and you become fairly okay or good at listening, then it's possible to take the person who is the most active resistor and within 6 months turn them into an advocate, a person who is actually leading change. We've seen this happen over and over again. Our leaders here at Capital One are starting to actively use MI, and we've gone from slow change to a fast rate of change in many cases. So let's recap on a few key points. We must meet each associate where they are in their change journey. Coaching works well for associates who are willing and ready to be coached. Coaching does not work well for those that are not ready. Motivational interviewing assists associates who are not ready for coaching. And we cannot change another person. Change comes from within. And accurate empathy is the single best predictor of a high success rate in addicted to status quo conversations. So if we really, really want change to occur, we've got to go from being tellers or persuaders to listeners using accurate empathy. Okay, so now where do you learn more? Well, so there's many places you can go. You can go to our website, onesystem1voice.com, and there you will find lots of materials that you can use for reference. We encourage you to use those. We give those away free to anybody and everybody. And each time that we do a conference or a workshop and we learn more, we share that material on the website. As you have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We will respond to all of your questions. You can go to some of the other sites there, and some of them offer YouTube, so you can actually observe conversations. And very soon, Target Magazine is releasing an article. It's coming into print as we speak, called Lean Coaching, and it will take you through a lot of what we've learned today, talk about the different stages of change and what you as a listener need to do during those stages of change. So again, if you want to know more, please reach out to us at onesystem1voice.com. I'm Ron Oslin. Two of our other lead coaches are Tony Shamlin and Larry Anderson. All of us will be more than happy to help you. One key thing I'm going to leave you with as a principle to remember: you can engineer processes and products. You can't engineer people. I so often hear leaders say, we need to rewire, we need to reprogram. That's great for computers. It's not so great for people. So remember, you cannot change people. They must change themselves. Thank you very much for spending 30 minutes with me today. If you have more questions, or you have lots of questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We will help you in any way we can. Again, thank you very much for your time today.
Ron, thank you for facilitating our session today. As mentioned previously, today's webinar is being recorded. Look for an email following our time together for a link to the recording. Feel free to share this throughout your organization. So again, thank you, Ron, and thanks to each of you for participating in today's session. Goodbye.